"Name?" the clerk asked, barely looking up. "Elias Monroe, Staff Sergeant, United States Army." No one in the courtroom reacted. No salute, no recognition, just another homeless man in cuffs, arrested for trying to stay warm behind a cafe. But when the judge finally looked at the file, she froze. Her hands trembled. Then she stood up in silence. Because Monroe wasn't just another name on the docket. He was the soldier who once carried her wounded son through enemy fire in Afghanistan. This wasn't just a case. It was a reckoning. If that hit you deep, comment respect for the forgotten heroes. The cold that night didn't feel like weather. It felt like punishment. Bitter wind funneled through the narrow alley behind Millie's cafe, turning brick walls into slabs of ice and metal dumpsters into frost-covered tombstones. Tucked behind one of them, Elias Monroe curled in on himself, his threadbare coat pulled tight, a knit cap barely covering ears that stung from exposure. Steam drifted weakly from the cafe's kitchen vent, the only warmth for blocks. He pressed close to it, not daring to fall asleep but too tired to stay fully awake. The sandwich in his hands had been a quiet offering. One of the line cooks, barely older than a teenager, had opened the back door and slipped it to him without a word. Elias had nodded, murmured a thank you. They had an unspoken understanding. He didn't ask for more. He didn't loiter when asked to leave. He never made a scene. But tonight, he'd stayed too long. The patrol car pulled in just before midnight, headlights sweeping the alley like a searchlight in an old war movie. Elias didn't move. Maybe if he stayed still, they'd pass him by. But they didn't. A door opened. Boots crunched on gravel. "Sir," came the voice, firm but not cruel. "You can't sleep here." Elias looked up slowly, his joints protesting. "Just 5 more minutes," he said. "Ain't bothering no one, just finishing this off." He held up the half-eaten sandwich like evidence. The officer hesitated, maybe even pitied him. But the call had been made. The cafe manager had complained. Again. "You've been warned," the officer said, voice softening. "I'm sorry, but I've got to take you in." He didn't fight the cuffs. They slid over his wrists without resistance. His breath came in shallow gasps, more from the cold than from fear. As they led him away, he glanced once over his shoulder at the vent, the last shred of warmth disappearing behind him. Booking was fast. Trespassing. Disturbing the peace. Resisting, technically, though Elias had only paused. When they asked for his name, he answered automatically, the syllables dull from repetition. "Elias Monroe, Staff Sergeant, United States Army." No reaction. No flicker of recognition. By 3 a.m., he was in a holding cell, knees to chest, shivering against cinder-block walls. Once he'd led soldiers through enemy fire. Now, he couldn't find shelter behind a cafe. His only crime, trying not to freeze to death. The courtroom buzzed with the low hum of routine, shuffling papers, muted whispers, the occasional clack of a gavel. It was the kind of morning where cases blurred together, faces passed without memory, and justice moved like machinery on a conveyor belt. Docket after docket. Names called. Charges read. Most barely earned a second glance. In the back, Elias Monroe sat in the defendant's chair, hands cuffed in front of him, ankles chained loosely together. The orange jumpsuit hung awkwardly from his thin frame, the fabric swallowing what little muscle remained on his once broad shoulders. His face, weathered and hollow, bore the quiet resignation of someone who expected nothing, not mercy, not understanding, not even acknowledgement. "Case number 18B, City versus Elias Monroe," the clerk called. The bailiff nudged him gently. Elias stood with effort, the chains rattling slightly as he rose. All eyes flicked to him, then away just as quickly. Just another vagrant in a line of petty charges. Just another burden the court had to process and move along. The judge didn't look up from the file. "State your name for the record," she said, voice clipped and even. Elias cleared his throat, a sound more rasp than voice. "Elias Monroe," he said. Then after a pause, because old habits died hard, and some things still mattered even if no one cared, he added, "Staff Sergeant, United States Army." The courtroom didn't react. No gasps, no glances, no flicker of recognition, just the shuffle of papers continuing as if the words were empty. He might as well have said nothing at all. The prosecutor, a young man with polished shoes and a perfectly knotted tie, barely looked at him. "Your Honor, the defendant has been cited multiple times for loitering and trespassing. This is his third arrest in as many months. We recommend a 30-day hold and mandatory exclusion from downtown commercial zones." Elias said nothing. He kept his eyes down, staring at the worn toes of his borrowed shoes. The words swirled above him like smoke, meaningless, expected, routine. The judge finally looked up. Her eyes flicked to the man before her. Something about the name scratched at the back of her mind, like a door she hadn't opened in years. Elias stood motionless. He had no lawyer beside him, no one to speak on his behalf. Just a name, softly spoken, a rank, a branch of service. And still no one stood. Not yet. Judge Margaret Hale arrived at the courthouse just after 7 o'clock a.m., coffee in hand, coat pulled tight against the morning chill. She moved with practiced precision, every step part of a rhythm honed over 2 decades on the bench. She was known for her control, measured, meticulous, rarely moved by theatrics or tears. Her courtroom ran on order, her rulings on logic. Emotion had no place behind the bench. She entered chambers, hung her coat, and began reviewing the day's docket. A thick stack of case files awaited, each tabbed and color-coded. Petty theft, vandalism, drug possession, the usual. She flipped through them with quiet efficiency, lips pursed in concentration. Midway through the stack, she came to a thin folder with a yellow sticky note half detached from its corner. Defendant, Elias Monroe, trespassing. Disturbing the peace, 3rd offense. Margaret paused. Something about the name caught her. Familiar, but not immediately placeable. She brushed it aside, more focused on the charges. Another homeless veteran, perhaps. Sad, but not uncommon. She'd seen too many like him come and go, broken by war, forgotten by the country they served. Still, she read on. The file was sparse. No attorney of record, no prior felonies, just minor offenses, all centered around the same alley behind Millie's Cafe. A note from the arresting officer mentioned the defendant had refused to leave when ordered, citing the cold and a need to finish a sandwich. Margaret shook her head slightly. That was the part no one ever saw. The sandwich. The human details. Just charges on paper. Her eyes moved to the personal information. Name: Elias James Monroe. Date of birth: 12/14/1968. Military service: U.S. Army, 1988 and 2008. Rank: Staff Sergeant. She froze. The name again. Elias Monroe, and that birth date. A memory stirred. Soft at first, then sharper. A letter. A name mentioned in passing. Her son's voice in her mind, reading a report from Afghanistan. A man who carried him under fire, a man named Monroe. She blinked, trying to steady herself. This couldn't be the same person. That Monroe had disappeared years ago, after the war, after saving her son's life. But the details. They fit too well. Her fingers gripped the folder tighter, and for the first time in years her practiced composure cracked ever so slightly. She stared at the name again, Elias Monroe, and suddenly routine no longer applied. Judge Hale sat motionless in her chambers, the thin manila folder open before her. Outside, the courthouse ticked along, phones ringing, heels clicking down tiled floors, clerks shuffling paperwork with the same indifferent rhythm that governed every weekday morning. But inside her office, time had stopped. Her eyes skimmed the page again, slower this time. Not the charges, those were straightforward. Trespassing, disturbing the peace, minor infractions, no weapons, no drugs, no resistance. But the name, Elias James Monroe. It echoed through her like a forgotten melody suddenly remembered. Her breath caught in her throat, and she pressed her palm gently against the folder as if grounding herself. The name hadn't appeared in years, not in news reports, not in military communications, not even in the letters she'd clung to like oxygen after her son died. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a small wooden box, one few people even knew she kept. Inside were yellowed envelopes, creased with age and handled too many times. Her son, Lieutenant Aaron Hale, had written her from deployment nearly every week. One letter in particular. She found it near the bottom of the stack, unfolded it with care. She didn't need to read it. She knew every word. Mom, if not for a man named Staff Sergeant Elias Monroe, I wouldn't be writing this. He pulled me out after the convoy was hit. Took 2 rounds himself. Never slowed down. I tried to order him to leave me, but he said, "Not while I'm breathing, sir." Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered the letter beside the case file. It couldn't be that Elias Monroe had vanished after his 3rd tour. No forwarding address, no follow-up contact. The Army had informed her he'd been honorably discharged, but offered no details beyond that. But here he was, homeless, alone, arrested for warming himself by a cafe vent. She turned back to the file, now seeing it not as a case but as a person, a soldier, a savior, and something inside her cracked wide open. The robe she wore, the authority she held, all of it felt heavy now, hollow in the presence of this truth. She whispered the name again, Elias Monroe. And in that moment she knew this was not just another docket on a busy morning. This was the man who gave her son a second chance to live. And now fate had brought him to her courtroom. The heat in Afghanistan in 2005 was the kind that pressed against skin like a weight, choking and inescapable. The sun hung mercilessly over the jagged ridgelines of Kunar province as dust curled from the tires of a Humvee convoy snaking its way through hostile terrain. Then came the explosion. A deafening blast tore through the lead vehicle, hurling shrapnel and fire into the sky. Gunfire followed, sharp, erratic, and close. The world descended into chaos. Lieutenant Aaron Hale lay in the dirt, dazed and bleeding. His ears rang, his right leg was twisted unnaturally beneath him. He tried to move, tried to call out, but the words caught in his throat. The radio was silent. Men screamed around him. Return fire crackled overhead. Then he saw him, a figure cutting through the smoke. Broad, steady, terrifying in purpose. Staff Sergeant Elias Monroe didn't hesitate. He moved with the grim calm of someone who'd done this too many times to count. Bullets cracked past his helmet, thudded into the earth around him, but he didn't flinch. He didn't slow down. He dropped to one knee beside the wounded officer, assessing him with a glance. Blood soaked Aaron's pants leg and his chest heaved in short, panicked breaths. "Lieutenant, you with me?" Monroe barked, already reaching under his arms. "You gotta leave me," Aaron gasped. "Get the others." "Not while I'm breathing, sir." Monroe hoisted him up like dead weight, teeth clenched, dragging him across the scorching dirt toward a collapsed stone wall. A round tore through Monroe's left bicep. He staggered but kept moving. Another grazed his side. He didn't stop. He set Aaron down behind the wall and turned, laying down suppressing fire with practiced precision. His voice rose over the gunfire, shouting orders, directing movement, calling for medevac. They held the position for 20 minutes until reinforcements arrived. When the helicopter finally lifted Aaron out, he was semi-conscious, vision fading, but he remembered one thing: Elias Monroe standing bloodied and grim at the landing zone, refusing treatment until every other soldier had been counted, every wounded man evacuated. Later, in a hospital bed in Germany, Aaron wrote a letter to his mother. He didn't talk about pain or fear. He wrote about Monroe, the man who ran through fire, the man who wouldn't leave him behind, the man who vanished after saving his life. The courtroom settled into its usual rhythm. Cases called, charges read, justice delivered like clockwork. The hum of shuffling papers and murmured side conversations filled the stale air. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the worn wooden benches and tired faces. Elias Monroe sat silently at the defendant's table, the chains on his ankles barely making a sound now, as if even they had grown weary. His posture was slumped, but not defeated, more like a man conserving what little strength he had left. He didn't look around the room. He didn't try to explain himself. He just waited, as he'd waited for so many things in the years since his discharge. Help, answers, a place to belong. At the other table, the prosecutor, a young man fresh out of law school, his tie crisp, his voice confident, rose to speak. "Your Honor, the defendant has been found trespassing behind Millie's Cafe for the third time this winter. He has been repeatedly warned. The property owner has filed formal complaints. The individual has no fixed residence, no employment. He was found loitering in a restricted service alley and refused to leave when instructed by responding officers." The words came fast, efficient, well-rehearsed. There was no cruelty in his tone, just detachment. Elias wasn't a person in that moment. He was paperwork, a problem to be filed away. Judge Hale didn't interrupt. Not yet. Her eyes were fixed on Elias, her mind torn between two realities, one unfolding before her in real time, and another playing out behind her eyes, 15 years in the past. The name on the docket echoed through her like a bell, louder with each beat of her heart. The prosecutor continued, "We're requesting a 30-day hold and a no trespass order for the downtown corridor. That would include the vicinity of the cafe and nearby shelters. This is in line with city policy in prior cases." Elias didn't flinch. He had heard worse. He had endured worse. Cold concrete floors, nights with no roof, days passed by like fog, people walking around him as if he were invisible. He wasn't surprised. He didn't expect mercy. Judge Hale took a slow breath. She closed the file in front of her, fingertips pressed lightly on the cover. Her eyes remained on the man in cuffs, the same man whose name her son had written in letters home, the same man who had carried him through fire. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but something had shifted. A storm was building, quiet, sure, and irreversible. And Elias Monroe was not going to be forgotten. Not this time. The judge adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. The file in front of her remained closed. The prosecutor sat down, his polished arguments filed neatly away like another case resolved. The courtroom settled into a moment of pause, the kind that often preceded sentencing. But Judge Hale didn't speak. Not yet. She looked to the defendant's table. "Mr. Monroe," she said, her voice steady, "do you have representation with you today?" Elias lifted his head slowly. His eyes were tired, rimmed with the weight of years spent without shelter, without rest. "No, ma'am," he said. Public defender was called into another courtroom. They said someone might come by later, but no one did. There was no resentment in his tone, just a quiet resignation, like a man so used to being overlooked that even abandonment had lost its sting. The judge nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Would you like to make a statement on your own behalf?" Elias hesitated. Speaking in court wasn't something he had done before. But he stood anyway, the chain at his ankles clinking faintly against the floor. His hands rested on the table, knuckles pale beneath his rough skin. "I don't got much to say," he began, his voice rough from disuse. "Wasn't trying to cause trouble. Wasn't bothering nobody." He glanced briefly toward the prosecutor, then down at the floor. "It's been cold," he continued, "real cold. That alley behind the cafe, there's a vent from the kitchen. Blows out warm air at night. I just sit there sometimes, that's all. Don't ask for nothing, don't take nothing." He looked up again, eyes meeting the judge's. "Ain't got a place to go. Been that way a while. No family, no home, just me. I wasn't resisting when the officer came, I asked for 5 more minutes to finish my sandwich." His voice broke slightly on the last word, but he caught himself. "I know I ain't supposed to be there, I don't got anywhere else. Not anymore." The room was quiet. No murmurs from the gallery, no scribbling from the clerk. Even the prosecutor didn't shift in his seat. Judge Hale kept her gaze on Elias. Something in her eyes had changed. Subtle, but undeniable. Not pity. Something deeper. Something that had been waiting a long time to resurface. She folded her hands, not to scold or to sentence, but to listen. Because in that brief, unpolished truth, Elias Monroe had said more than any lawyer ever could. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open just as Judge Hale reached for her gavel. All eyes turned. A man entered, tall, composed, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that didn't belong in this corner of municipal court. His shoes barely made a sound as he crossed the room, confidence quiet and purposeful. He carried a slim leather briefcase and a presence that shifted the air. He stepped directly to the defense table and placed the case gently beside Elias Monroe, who blinked at him in confusion. The man nodded once, then turned to address the bench. "Your Honor, my name is Daniel Reed. I'm here to represent Mr. Monroe, pro bono." A pause, small but heavy. Judge Hale's brows lifted, eyes narrowing with careful curiosity. "Mr. Reed, the court wasn't notified of any change in representation." "I understand, Your Honor," Reed replied smoothly. "This is a very recent development." Elias stared at the man beside him as if trying to recognize a face from a dream. I didn't call anyone," he whispered, low enough that only Reed could hear. "You didn't have to," Reed answered quietly. "Someone else did." Judge Hale looked from Elias to Reed, then back again. "And what is your relationship to the defendant?" "None, personally. A colleague brought Mr. Monroe's situation to my attention this morning. We felt compelled to act." The room remained still. Even the prosecutor seemed caught off guard, flipping through papers as if searching for an explanation that didn't exist. Reed leaned slightly toward Elias. "May I sit?" Elias gave the faintest nod, still dazed, unsure if the courtroom had become a dream or if this man beside him was real. No one had stood beside him in years, not like this, not without asking for something in return. Judge Hale considered them both in silence, then glanced at the clerk. "We'll take a 15-minute recess to allow counsel to confer with his client." Her voice was neutral, but her eyes lingered on Elias before she rose from the bench. As the room emptied in hushed curiosity, Elias leaned toward the attorney and asked again, barely audible, "Why are you doing this?" Reed didn't answer right away. He just opened the briefcase, laid out a legal pad, and looked him in the eyes. "Because someone finally remembered your name." Judge Hale didn't hear the shuffle of chairs or the faint murmurs rising in the gallery. She didn't glance at the young prosecutor flipping through his notes, nor at the attorney now seated beside Elias Monroe. Her eyes remained fixed on the defendant, on the man who had spoken so little, and yet somehow shattered something inside her that she thought had long ago turned to stone. She reached for her gavel with steady fingers, though her hand trembled just before it touched the wood. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," she said, her voice tight but controlled. "The defendant may remain seated while counsel confers." She rose without waiting for acknowledgement, her robe sweeping behind her as she moved swiftly through the side door leading to chambers. The moment it closed behind her, the mask slipped. Her breath escaped in a sharp exhale, and her spine bent just slightly, as if the weight she carried had finally declared itself. Inside the stillness of her office, she leaned against the desk, fingers gripping the edge until her knuckles turned white. The name had haunted her all morning, but now it screamed, clear, undeniable, and present. Elias Monroe. Her son had spoken that name with reverence in the hospital bed. He had called Monroe a force of nature, a man who didn't flinch when everything fell apart, who carried wounded men like they were feathers, who refused to leave anyone behind even as bullets tore the ground apart around him. That man now sat in her courtroom, broken, forgotten, and dressed in a jumpsuit that disguised everything he once stood for. She turned slowly toward the bookshelf in the corner and opened the drawer at its base. Her hands, still unsteady, searched through yellowing papers and brittle photographs until they found the one she hadn't looked at in years. A grainy snapshot. Her son, Aaron, fresh-faced in uniform, smiling with an arm draped over the shoulder of another man, taller, sterner, but with a faint, reluctant grin. Elias Monroe. Her pulse thundered. She closed her eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the sickening realization. She hadn't failed to remember him. The world had. And now fate, or something greater, had brought him back into her courtroom. Not as a hero, but as a charge. A case number, a line on a docket. The past wasn't just catching up. It was demanding to be reckoned with. Judge Hale sat alone in her chambers, the walls around her no longer offering the comfort of routine. They felt smaller now, too close, as if they too recognized the weight pressing down on her chest. Her hands moved with practiced certainty as she unlocked the bottom drawer of her desk, a place she hadn't opened in years, not because she forgot what was in it, but because remembering hurt too much. The key turned with a soft click. She slid the drawer open and pulled out a weathered wooden box, the grain darkened with age, the brass hinges slightly rusted. She laid it on her desk gently, as if the memories inside might crumble if disturbed too quickly. Lifting the lid, she found what she expected. A stack of letters neatly bound in twine, each envelope marked with a date and the unmistakable block handwriting of her son. Lieutenant Aaron Hale, killed in action, 2005. She untied the bundle and thumbed through them until she found the one, creased at the edges, the ink slightly smudged from the day she first read it with shaking hands, and a mother's worst fear realized. She unfolded it carefully. "Hey, Mom," the letter began. "I'm okay, more or less. We got hit yesterday, the kind of thing they tell you about in training but hope you never see. Her eyes moved slowly, already knowing the words, but needing to see them again. I caught shrapnel in my leg. Nothing life-threatening. But I was pinned. Couldn't move. The firefight was still going when he came for me. Staff Sergeant Monroe. Man moved like he didn't care whether he lived or died, only that we did. He dragged me through a kill zone and got hit twice himself. Told me, "You don't leave your people behind, not while I'm breathing." She paused there, fingers brushing the ink as if she could feel her son's voice through the page. If I don't make it home, know he gave me a second chance. He didn't just save me, he reminded me what kind of man I want to be. A tear slipped down her cheek, tracing the line of her jaw before falling to the desk. She didn't brush it away. That man, her son's lifeline, the one whose name had lived in her heart like a sacred vow, was sitting just yards away, forgotten by a country he bled for. Not anymore. She folded the letter with trembling hands, placed it back in the box, and stood with a quiet resolve that left no room for hesitation. Justice, for once, would have a memory. Judge Hale sat at her desk, the open letter still beside her like an open wound. Her hand hovered over the phone, her fingertips trembling slightly before she finally lifted the receiver. She didn't look at her notes. She didn't need to. The name was seared into her memory. Elias Monroe. Her son's rescuer. Her son's ghost. She punched in the number with quiet urgency. It rang twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered. Colonel David Ryland. She closed her eyes briefly at the sound. David, it's Margaret Hale. A pause. Judge Hale, he said, formal by habit, then softened. Maggie, it's been years. I need your help, she said, her voice low. It's important. I have a man in my courtroom, homeless, arrested for trespassing. His name is Elias Monroe. Another pause. Longer this time. I need to know if he's who I think he is, she continued. Staff Sergeant, served with the 173rd Airborne. Kunar Province, April 2005. The colonel didn't answer right away. She heard rustling papers on his end, maybe a keyboard, maybe just the weight of memory shifting. Then finally, he spoke. He was there, Ryland said quietly. 2nd Platoon, your son's unit. Her breath caught. Was he the one? Ryland exhaled. He pulled Aaron out under fire, carried him on his back while returning fire with one hand, got hit twice, refused evac until the others were safe. I wrote him up for a Silver Star, got caught in the red tape. Last I heard, he was discharged with injuries. PTSD, no forwarding address. We lost track of him. No recognition? She asked, her voice sharp now, disbelief bleeding into anger. No, Ryland said. His case got buried. He didn't push. You know how it is. Quiet ones always fall through the cracks. After the discharge, it's like he disappeared. She felt the heat rise behind her eyes. This man had risked everything for her son, had bled for him, and the country had let him fade into dust in alleyways. Thank you, David, she said, the words barely audible. Is it really him? She looked out the narrow window, down into the courthouse courtyard, though she couldn't see the courtroom from here. Yes, she said, it's him. She hung up the phone slowly, her pulse steady now, her mind clear. Elias Monroe had been a hero, and they had forgotten him. But she wouldn't. Not again. Elias Monroe sat alone on the cold courtroom bench, his hands folded in his lap, the chain between his ankles resting quietly on the polished floor. The sounds around him were muffled, pages turning, shoes echoing off marble, doors opening and closing with a mechanical finality. He didn't look up, didn't track the people who passed by. After enough years on the street, you learn to disappear without moving. You learn that silence draws less attention than presence. His shoulders slumped beneath the weight of a life that had grown too heavy. The jumpsuit he wore sagged on his frame, his body thinned from years of poor sleep, poor food, and the kind of solitude that sinks into the bones. He didn't fidget. He didn't sigh. He just waited, the way a man does when he's already braced for whatever comes next. Elias had stopped hoping for anything from these places. Courtrooms were not arenas of justice to him. They were stopovers, pauses between shelters, a holding pattern between cold nights. He'd been here before. Different judge, different charge, same result. He expected nothing more than a firm voice, a fine he couldn't pay, and a ride back to a cell that at least had 4 walls and a mattress. The new lawyer, Reed, he said his name was, sat beside him now, flipping through a notepad and making quiet observations. Elias barely processed them. He didn't ask why this man had come or who had sent him. He'd learned not to question small kindnesses. They were fleeting, and if you clung too tightly, they dissolved. What he didn't know, couldn't have guessed, was that somewhere behind the wooden panels of this very courthouse, someone had opened a drawer and pulled out a letter written in a war zone. Someone had remembered the name he'd spoken with cracked lips and a bowed head. Someone who had once received the last words of her son, words that had pointed to Elias Monroe as the reason he was still breathing when that letter was penned. But Elias didn't know any of that. Not yet. He sat in stillness, unaware that fate had finally stirred. Unaware that, for the first time in decades, someone was moving heaven and earth to make sure he wasn't forgotten. He didn't know it, but the silence was shifting, and it would never be quiet in the same way again. The courtroom doors opened again, and people filed back to their seats with the usual shuffle of coats and papers, the casual rhythm of routine re-establishing itself. But something was different now. Subtle, almost imperceptible, like the shift in air before a storm. The clerk adjusted her microphone. The bailiff returned to his post. The young prosecutor tapped his pen, none the wiser to the undercurrent that had begun to pull through the room. Judge Margaret Hale re-entered from chambers. She moved with her usual composure, but there was something altered in her presence, something quieter, heavier. Her robe flowed behind her like always, but her hands, now clasped together in front of her, were still. She sat, and the gavel sounded once, a single note that echoed longer than it should have. "Mr. Reed," she said, eyes flicking toward Elias's attorney, "have you had sufficient time to confer with your client?" "We have, Your Honor," Reed replied. She nodded, then looked directly at Elias. Her expression was careful, not cold, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer than before, lower, almost gentle. "Mr. Monroe," she said, "I'd like to ask you a few questions, if that's all right." Elias blinked, surprised. No judge had ever asked him anything that wasn't already written in a report. "Yes, ma'am," he said, clearing his throat. "Your file indicates you served in the United States Army," she continued, her words deliberate. "Can you confirm the years?" 1988 to 2008, Elias answered. 20 years. "And your rank at discharge?" "Staff Sergeant," he said. E6, 2nd Platoon, 173rd Airborne. His voice held no pride, no bitterness, just facts, like reciting a name or a date of birth, things that used to mean something once. "Were you stationed in Afghanistan in 2005? "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Kunar Province, outskirts of Asadabad." Her pen hovered above the page, but she didn't write anything down. She just looked at him, really looked, as if trying to reconcile the man before her with the one she'd heard about in letters and military reports. "Do you recall an incident involving an ambush on a convoy on April 12th of that year?" Elias's jaw tensed. He looked away for a moment, blinking slowly. When he spoke, his voice dropped a little lower. "Yes. We lost 3. Pulled 2 out myself. One of them was a lieutenant, took shrapnel to the leg, told me to leave him." He paused. I didn't. The courtroom was silent. Judge Hale said nothing more, but her hand, resting on the bench, curled into a quiet fist. Something had returned to her voice, and something was waking in Elias Monroe. The judge leaned forward slightly, her glasses sliding down just enough for her eyes to meet Elias's directly. The room held its breath without knowing why. Even the prosecutor, shuffling his notes just moments before, seemed to sense that the ground beneath the courtroom had subtly shifted. Something unspoken pressed at the edges of the silence. Judge Hale's voice, though steady, carried a weight now. Not legal authority, but memory. "Mr. Monroe," she said slowly, "were you involved in an operation called Red River Ridge? April 3rd, 2005? The name hit the air like a forgotten hymn. Elias stiffened. His gaze dropped to the table, his fingers curling slightly, knuckles pale beneath thin skin. He didn't answer right away. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. The judge waited. She didn't rush him. Elias lifted his head. His voice, when it came, was low and matter-of-fact, as if reciting something long buried. "Yes, ma'am, that's where we got hit bad. They set up a kill zone in the valley just past Checkpoint 5. We walked straight into it." He paused, blinking slowly, as if the dust of that place still lingered behind his eyes. "Most of the convoy was pinned. Lost radio contact. Took us 5 minutes to realize our lead vehicle was disabled. Couldn't reach the others. I moved forward with 2 men, tried to pull wounded back. One of them was a lieutenant, young, brave, but stubborn." Elias's voice caught for the briefest second. "He took shrapnel through the leg, couldn't walk, ordered me to leave him." He looked down again, fingers twitching against the tabletop like he was still gripping the sling of a rifle. "But I didn't," he said. "I carried him out." The courtroom was silent. Even the hum of the overhead light seemed to fade. Judge Hale's hand tightened slightly around her pen. "What was the lieutenant's name?" she asked, though her voice had softened to something barely above a whisper. Elias exhaled slowly, the name emerging like a ghost returning home. "Hale," he said. "Lieutenant Aaron Hale." The room did not gasp. It simply stilled, as though the air itself understood what had just been spoken. The judge closed her eyes, just briefly, and when she opened them again, they glistened. But she did not look away. She had found the man her son once called his guardian angel, and he was sitting in chains. The words settled over the room like a sudden snowfall, soft, silent, and impossible to ignore. Lieutenant Aaron Hale. It took only a second for the realization to ripple through the courtroom, but in that second, time stopped. The prosecutor, mid-turn of a page, froze completely, his pen hovering uselessly above the paper. A low murmur began in the gallery, the kind born not of confusion, but of recognition, of something rare, something real, breaking through the monotony of legal procedure. Even the bailiff, trained to keep order through indifference, blinked twice and looked toward the bench. Judge Hale didn't move. Her breath hitched just once, but the sound echoed loud in her own ears. For a moment she stared at Elias as if seeing through him, past the worn jumpsuit and sunken cheeks, past the shackles and the tired posture. What she saw now wasn't the man sitting before her, but the one she'd seen in the faded photograph from her son's letters. Strong, serious, and standing with a reluctant kind of pride beside Aaron in dusty combat gear. Her jaw tightened, but not from anger. It was the effort of control, of holding in a tide she hadn't anticipated breaking. Her hand moved, barely, toward her chest, where beneath the layers of her robe beat a heart that had spent years buried beneath logic, rulings, and precedent. The gavel remained untouched. No one dared speak. Elias looked down, uneasy with the silence, not yet understanding why the air had thickened, or why the judge was staring at him like that. He had said the name because it was part of the story, not a confession, not a claim. Just a memory that still woke him up some nights, too real to forget, too painful to share. But for Judge Hale, the name was everything. Her son had died in that war. 2 weeks after the day Monroe had carried him from that kill zone. 2 more weeks of borrowed time. Time he had spent writing home, calling when he could, laughing one last time at stories she still replayed in her mind. 2 weeks of a life she never would have had without the man now sitting before her. Her composure cracked, just enough to reveal the grief beneath the surface. But what showed through wasn't weakness. It was something closer to reverence. This wasn't just a defendant anymore. This was the man who had carried her son through fire. Judge Hale didn't reach for the gavel. Her hand hovered there for a moment, then slowly withdrew. Her eyes never left Elias Monroe. The courtroom waited, uncertain, holding breath that didn't want to be let go. This was the moment in every case when order reasserted itself, when decisions were made, sentences handed down, and papers shuffled back into oblivion. But nothing moved. Nothing happened. Then, without a word, Judge Hale stood. She stepped down from the bench with quiet deliberation. The clack of her heels on the marble floor rang louder than her gavel ever had. The bailiff started to move, uncertain of protocol, but she held up a hand and continued toward the side door that led to chambers. Her robe rippled slightly as she disappeared behind it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with questions no one dared ask. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, unsure whether he should object or simply wait. The clerk looked to the gallery, then back to the empty bench. No one spoke. Even Elias, confused and still unsure why the name he had spoken had changed the temperature of the room, sat unmoving. He looked down at his hands, shackled and still. 5 minutes passed. Then 6. When the door opened again, she was not alone. Judge Hale re-entered the courtroom flanked by 3 uniformed military officers. One wore the crisp white of a full Navy dress uniform, the medals on his chest gleaming beneath the lights. Another, older, wore the subdued olive drab of an Army colonel, with stripes earned the hard way. Between them walked a corporal holding a polished wooden case, its lid closed but reverent in its very presence. Whispers rustled through the gallery. The prosecutor stood instinctively. Elias looked up, brow furrowed. He didn't understand. Not yet. Judge Hale returned to the bench but didn't sit. Instead, she turned to the courtroom with a gaze that held both gravity and grace. "I will not deliver a sentence today," she said, voice low but unshakable. "Not yet." She gestured to the colonel, who stepped forward and placed the wooden case on the table beside Elias. "For 2 decades," she said, "this man's service was forgotten. But not anymore." Elias stared at the box, then at her. No words came. The gavel hadn't fallen. But something far more powerful had: recognition, respect, and the beginning of justice. The corporal opened the wooden case with deliberate care, as if the contents were sacred, and in many ways they were. Inside lay 2 medals, each resting in velvet-lined compartments that had waited far too long to find their rightful owner. One, the Purple Heart, gleamed with its deep ribbon and solemn weight. The other, the Bronze Star with the V for valor, caught the courtroom light like a whisper of the battlefield still clinging to its edges. Elias didn't move at first. His eyes flicked to the medals, then to the colonel, then to Judge Hale, trying to understand if this was real or just another strange turn in a life that hadn't made sense in a long time. The colonel spoke with the measured cadence of military formality, but there was something reverent in his tone, something unpolished by ceremony. Staff Sergeant Elias Monroe, for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy during Operation Red River Ridge, it is my honor to present you with the Bronze Star with valor. And for wounds sustained in the line of duty, the United States Army recognizes you with the Purple Heart. He paused, then added more softly, "These were delayed, not denied. We owe you better." The corporal extended the medals toward Elias. Still shackled at the ankles, Elias rose slowly, unsure his body would carry the weight of this moment. His hands trembled slightly as he reached out, brushing his fingers against the cold metal. The Bronze Star. He'd seen others receive it. He'd written witness statements for it. But he had never expected to see his name on one. His mouth opened, but the words didn't come. Not yet. The gallery was quiet. No applause, no outburst. Just silence that somehow spoke louder than sound. Even the prosecutor, who moments ago had sought a sentence, now stood with arms at his sides, his expression unreadable, his tie suddenly feeling far too tight. Judge Hale remained standing, her eyes never leaving Elias. They held no pity, only something closer to awe. Or perhaps gratitude, a lifetime of it. Elias looked down at the medals in his hands. They felt heavy, not because of their weight, but because of what they carried. Years, loss, silence, survival, and finally, recognition. It had taken too long, but the uniform may have been packed away, the war long over, and the world too quick to forget, but in this moment, honor remembered his name. The courtroom remained suspended in stillness, as if no one dared to break the moment. Elias sat slowly, the medals still cradled in his calloused hands. He didn't look around, didn't meet the eyes that now stared at him with something far different than before. Reverence had replaced disregard. Wonder had silenced judgment. Still, Elias said nothing. He had never fought for recognition. He had never expected any of this. Then, from the prosecution's table, the young attorney who had once spoken with such assuredness and detachment rose to his feet. He looked far different now, his shoulders less squared, his expression softer, as if the courtroom had grown larger than him and he'd finally understood why. He didn't reach for his notes, didn't approach the bench. Instead, he cleared his throat and spoke directly to Elias. "Sir," he began, voice rough with the weight of humility, "we owe you an apology." Elias looked up, eyes narrowing not in suspicion, but in disbelief. Few people apologized to men like him. Fewer still did it with sincerity. "We had no idea who you were," the prosecutor continued, gesturing faintly with his open hands. "To us, you were just another case file. Just another name on a docket. And that was our failure." He took a breath, steadying himself. "I should have asked more questions. Looked deeper. I should have seen past the surface. We should have. You earned more than the cold language of charges and policies. You earned better." Elias didn't respond, but his eyes stayed locked on the young man now standing across the courtroom like someone facing a mirror for the first time. There was no pride in the prosecutor's voice, no performance, just regret, just truth. "We should have known," he said again, quieter this time. "And I'm sorry." The words hung in the room, unadorned and unpolished, but somehow more valuable than anything written in law books. Elias gave a small nod, not of forgiveness but of acknowledgement, of understanding. It was enough. Judge Hale remained still behind the bench, eyes glistening, hands folded before her. The courtroom had changed, not just in tone, but in purpose. For the first time in years, Elias Monroe had been seen not as a burden, but as a man. And even the system that once failed him had stopped, if only for a moment, to say what it never had before. "Thank you." Judge Hale looked down at the papers in front of her, though she didn't need to read them. The charges were etched into her mind, not because of their severity, but because of their smallness. Trespassing, loitering, disturbing the peace. Legal phrases assigned to a man who had once run through gunfire to pull the wounded from death's grip. A man who had been forgotten by the very country he swore to protect. She removed her glasses, folded them carefully, and set them down beside the gavel. When she looked up again, her gaze was steady, but not cold. There was something resolute in her posture now, not just as a judge, but as someone who had come face to face with the cost of forgetting. "This court has reviewed the charges against Mr. Elias Monroe," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, though it carried the undercurrent of something deeper, something earned. "And while they may meet the technical requirements of the law, I cannot, in good conscience, allow this case to proceed as if it were ordinary." A ripple passed through the gallery, but no one spoke. She turned slightly toward Elias. "You are not a criminal. You are not a problem to be processed or a name to be filed away. You are a soldier who returned home to a country that lost sight of its debt." Elias sat still, barely blinking. His hands, still resting on the table, held the medals quietly, as if afraid to believe they were truly his. "The law gives me discretion," Judge Hale continued, "and I will use every ounce of it today." She reached for the gavel, not to strike it in punishment, but to seal something long overdue. "All charges against Staff Sergeant Elias Monroe are hereby dismissed with prejudice," she said. "This case is closed, permanently." She struck the gavel once, but the sound that followed wasn't an ending. It was a release, a break in the silence that had buried Elias for years. He closed his eyes for a moment, not from relief, but from something heavier, the sudden staggering realization that someone had finally stood up for him, not with a weapon, not with a salute, but with truth. For the first time in decades, the system hadn't turned away. It had listened, and it had said, "You are not forgotten." The courtroom was still, the weight of silence transformed into something sacred. The gavel had fallen, but no one moved. It wasn't just the end of a case. It felt like the closing of a wound, one that had never properly healed, one that had festered in the shadows of a system too rigid to bend toward mercy. But now, something had changed. Judge Hale stood slowly, not with the authority of her robe, but with the gravity of a mother, a witness, and a woman reclaiming a truth long buried beneath silence. She stepped down from the bench, each movement deliberate. There was no rush in her steps, no urgency, just intention. The courtroom parted around her, watching, but not interfering. Even the bailiff remained frozen, understanding this moment didn't belong to law or order. It belonged to history, to memory. Elias watched her approach with quiet confusion, unsure of what to expect. He had never stood in a courtroom like this. He had stood in courtrooms where men were processed, judged, discarded. but never one where someone walked toward him not to accuse, but to thank. She stopped in front of him, close enough to see the lines time had carved into his face. The scars, the tired eyes, the quiet dignity. "You carried my son," she said, voice low but steady, "through gunfire, through fear, through hell." He swallowed, unsure what to say. He lowered his eyes, almost in apology, but she wasn't finished. "I read his letters," she continued. "I know what you did. Not just for him, but for others. For all of them. You didn't leave him behind. And for years, I've carried his memory without knowing the name of the man who gave us those last 2 weeks with him." Her eyes shimmered now, but her voice never cracked. "You carried my son," she repeated, softer this time. "Now I will carry your name." Elias blinked hard, his throat tightening. "You are not forgotten," she said. And in that moment she reached out, not for a handshake, not for a formal gesture, but simply to place her hand over his, gently, firmly, like anchoring someone back into the world. It wasn't ceremony, it was a promise. And for a man who had carried so many others through fire, someone was finally carrying him. The key turned in the lock with a soft click, a sound Elias hadn't heard in years, at least not from his side of the door. He stepped inside slowly, not sure if he was dreaming or trespassing. The apartment was small but clean, a modest 1-bedroom in a quiet complex on the edge of town. The kind of place with working heat, warm lights, and windows that didn't rattle in the wind. He stood in the entryway, still gripping the key, as if it might be taken back at any moment. A few steps in, and he saw the living room, a simple couch, a coffee table, a small bookshelf with nothing on it yet. The kitchen was tidy, stocked with the basics. A bowl of fruit sat on the counter, real fruit, not from a food line. He touched it, half expecting it to vanish. The walls were bare except for one frame. Someone had hung it before he arrived. Inside was a display case, the bronze star, the purple heart, a photograph of him in uniform, faded but proud, and, beneath it, a folded flag. His name was etched on a small brass plate below the medals. Staff Sergeant Elias Monroe, United States Army. He stared at it for a long time. The paperwork had gone through quicker than anyone expected. Judge Hale had called in favors, pulled strings, opened doors Elias never even knew existed. His VA file was reopened, corrected, and marked with 100% service-connected disability. His benefits were reinstated. His back pay, more than he'd ever seen in his life, was being processed. The Veteran Support Group had fast-tracked housing placement. He was told the apartment would be temporary, but Elias didn't care. It had walls, a bed, a door that locked from the inside, a place to sit and breathe without watching his back. He dropped his duffel on the floor. It was the same one he'd carried since his first deployment. He unzipped it slowly, as if disturbing something sacred. Inside were only a few possessions, a worn Bible, a crumpled letter from an old comrade, a photo of a younger version of himself standing beside a group of wide-eyed soldiers. And now, his medals. He sat on the edge of the bed. It didn't creak, it didn't smell like bleach or cold metal. For the first time in decades, Elias Monroe wasn't surviving. He was home. The school gymnasium smelled faintly of floor wax and pencil shavings, the scent of childhood and routine. Folding chairs lined the basketball court in uneven rows, and the echo of voices bounced off the high rafters where faded banners from past championships still hung. Teachers guided students to their seats, reminding them to sit quietly, whispering reminders about respect and attention. Few of the kids understood exactly why they were gathered, only that there was a special guest coming to speak. Veterans Day, they'd been told, Some nodded in understanding, others just hoped it meant they'd get out of math. Behind the curtain at the side of the stage, Elias Monroe stood alone, his fingers brushing nervously over the front of his old army jacket. It didn't fit like it used to. The shoulders sagged a little, and the stitching at the cuffs had been redone by a volunteer seamstress at the Veterans Outreach Center. But the medals on his chest were real. The weight of them was different now, less about the past, more about the man he was still becoming. He glanced at his reflection in the narrow window of the gym door. For a long time, he hadn't recognized that face. The beard was trimmed now, his eyes clearer, the wear of the street replaced by a quiet steadiness. He still carried the years with him, but they no longer dragged him down. A teacher approached and gave him a small, encouraging nod. "We're ready for you now, Sergeant Monroe." He stepped out to polite applause. Dozens of young faces turned to watch him walk across the stage. Some whispered. A few nudged their friends. But most were just curious. He reached the podium and stood behind the microphone, silent for a moment as he looked out at the sea of eyes. "My name is Elias Monroe," he said. "I served 20 years in the United States Army. I've been to places I hope you never have to go. I've seen what people are capable of at their best and their worst." His voice wasn't rehearsed. He didn't read from notes, he simply spoke. "I'm not here to talk about glory. War isn't glorious. But I want you to understand what service means. It means doing something bigger than yourself. It means showing up, again and again, even when no one's watching, even when it's hard." He paused, letting the words settle. "And sometimes, when you come home, people forget you. They forget what you gave, who you were. They walk past you on the street and see a problem instead of a person." Elias looked down for a second, then back at them. "But even if the world forgets, you don't have to." Silence followed. Then a single clap. Then another. Then the room rose. Every student, every teacher. Not because they were told to, because something in them understood that this man standing before them, this quiet, steady man, had lived through something most of them never would. Elias didn't bow. He didn't wave. He just stood tall, not because he was a soldier, but because finally someone saw him.